Hello, dear YouTube viewers. I hope you're doing well. Okay, so let's start our video. He had always lived a steady, disciplined life, one built on hard work and quiet consistency. His mornings began early, with the hum of the kettle in the kitchen and the ritual of checking his emails before leaving for work. At the office, he was known as dependable, the kind of man people trusted with responsibilities because they knew he would never cut corners. In the evenings, he returned home with a sense of comfort, his house, his routines, his wife waiting for him. For him, marriage was a promise he carried close to his heart, and his loyalty was not something he questioned. Even on the days when exhaustion pressed heavily on his shoulders, he reminded himself that patience and commitment were the foundations of love. She was the brighter flame between them, the one who drew people in with her laughter and sharp presence. Wherever she went, eyes seemed to follow her, and she thrived on that attention. Friends often teased her about how easily she could charm a room, and she never denied it. If anything, she wore it proudly. With co-workers, she spoke in playful tones. With strangers, she exchanged knowing smiles. And at home, she liked being admired just as much. Yet, beneath her charm, he noticed a restlessness. Sometimes, in quiet moments, she sighed as though the life they built together was too ordinary, too predictable. Jokingly, she would say things like, "You don't notice me anymore," or "Maybe I should start charging for all the compliments I never get." He laughed it off, never wanting to believe her words carried weight, but the flicker of discontent in her eyes lingered longer than her jokes. It wasn't long before her nights stretched later than before. At first, it seemed harmless, an occasional dinner with friends, a late project at work, or a sudden need for fresh air. But soon the pattern grew familiar. She would leave in the evening, dressed a little more elegantly than necessary for casual outings, her perfume lingering in the air even after she shut the door. Sometimes she would come back past midnight, makeup smudged, yet lips curled into a satisfied smile, offering little explanation except vague lines about being with the girls or having lost track of time. He noticed her phone rarely left her hand anymore, her fingers typing quickly, her face turning slightly away whenever he walked into the room. She brushed off his questions with quick laughs or dismissive words, leaving him with a sense that something was slipping from his grasp. He told himself not to rush to judgment, that love required trust, and trust meant giving her the benefit of the doubt. Yet as the days went on, he could not ignore the gnawing unease inside him. Quietly, he began to question himself. Was he failing her in some way? Was his steady, predictable nature too plain for someone who craved the thrill of being noticed? He stood in front of the mirror at night, staring at his reflection, wondering if he had become invisible to the woman he loved. And though the doubts weighed heavily, his heart urged patience. He chose silence over confrontation, hoping she would tire of her late nights and return to the warmth of the life they had built. Still, in the corners of his mind, a seed of fear had been planted, one that whispered of cracks in their marriage, cracks he wasn't sure how to seal. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Night after night, she slipped out with casual excuses, and more often than not, she returned long after midnight. Sometimes she would come in quietly, tiptoeing as if not to disturb him. Other times she walked through the door with a dismissive air, tossing her heels aside and brushing past him without explanation. When he asked where she had been, her answers were thin, her voice sharp, as if his concern was an irritation rather than care. "You're overthinking," she said more than once, rolling her eyes at his steady questions. Another evening, when he tried again, she snapped, "I just want to feel alive." "Is that such a crime?" He sat in silence, the words echoing in his chest like an accusation, though he knew he hadn't done anything wrong. The house itself began to feel colder. Meals were no longer shared with laughter or casual conversation. Instead, she scrolled on her phone, half listening when he spoke. Intimacy, once natural, faded into avoidance, touches pulled away, glances dodged. Her body turned from his at night in bed. He felt the shift deeply, not just as a husband, but as a man who had given his heart fully to someone who no longer seemed to want it. The warmth that had once defined their home was replaced by an unspoken tension, a silence that stretched between them like an unbridgeable gap. In his solitude, he began to write. Late at night, when the house was quiet and she had not yet returned, he filled the pages of a small journal with his thoughts. He wrote about his confusion, his sadness, his fear of losing her, but also about his stubborn loyalty. He wrote to make sense of what he could not say aloud. On some nights, his words carried hope, promises to himself to be more attentive, more spontaneous, to rekindle what might have been fading. On other nights, the ink bled with despair, questions of whether love alone was enough when one heart had already wandered. It was during one of their arguments, one of those heated exchanges sparked by his simple questions, that she finally revealed more than she intended. He had asked her if she was truly happy, if she wanted to keep living like strangers. Her face flushed with frustration, and she burst out, "I just want to feel desired. I'm tired of feeling invisible." The words cut through him more sharply than any insult could. For a long moment, he couldn't speak, staring at her as if she were someone he no longer recognized. He tried to steady himself, tried to answer softly, promising that she wasn't invisible to him, that he loved her, that he saw her more than anyone else ever could. But she only shrugged, as if his reassurances meant little, as if his love was not the kind she craved. That night, he lay awake beside her, her back turned to him, replaying her words over and over. Invisible. The thought haunted him, because it was not just a complaint, it was a confession. She was seeking something beyond what he could offer, and though he had not yet seen it, he felt it pressing closer with each passing day. Others began to notice as well. A friend from work asked if everything was all right at home, remarking on how distant and distracted he had seemed lately. At a family dinner, his sister quietly pulled him aside, saying she had noticed how his wife avoided conversation, how she seemed eager to leave. The outside world was starting to see what he had been trying to keep hidden. It was one conversation with his closest friend that forced him to face the reality he had been avoiding. Sitting across from him in a quiet cafe, his friend listened to his worries, his half-spoken fears, and then said plainly, "She's chasing something outside your marriage. You need to be ready." The words settled heavily on his shoulders. He wanted to deny it, to insist that things could still be mended, but deep down, he knew his friend wasn't wrong. From that day forward, he braced himself. He didn't know what form the confrontation would take, or when it would come, but he felt it looming over them like a storm gathering at the edge of the sky. He carried himself with quiet patience, but in his heart, he began preparing for the moment when her choices would finally step into the open, and he would be forced to decide what kind of man he would be, one who begged for scraps of love, or one who stood with dignity, even in heartbreak. That evening, the air inside the house felt heavier than usual, as though it already knew what was about to unfold. She appeared at the bedroom door, dressed more glamorously than he had seen her in months. Her hair was styled with deliberate care, her lips painted in a deep shade of red, her dress clinging to her like a statement. He looked up from where he sat on the edge of the bed, his voice steady but edged with concern. "Where are you going this late?" She didn't even pause to meet his eyes. Her tone was clipped, distant. "Out. Don't wait up." The words struck him harder than he expected. He had heard dismissive remarks from her before, but tonight they felt colder, heavier, final. He studied her silhouette as she walked away, the sound of her heels clicking against the wooden floor fading until the front door closed. A silence filled the house, sharp and suffocating. He couldn't explain why, but something in his chest told him this night was different, that when she left, a part of their marriage went with her. He remained awake, unable to surrender to sleep. The clock ticked relentlessly, marking each passing minute with a weight that settled deeper into his chest. He walked the living room in circles, pausing at the window, staring into the darkness outside, as if it might reveal answers. His heart churned with conflicting storms, anger at her indifference, sadness at what they had become, betrayal gnawing at his gut, and strangely, a calm acceptance that the end had already begun. In the stillness of the night, his mind drifted backward, pulling him into memories he had long tucked away. He remembered the way she once laughed at his jokes, the way her eyes softened when she leaned on his shoulder. He remembered their first trip together, how she had clung to him during a rainstorm, and how, back then, her smile had been enough to brighten entire days. Those moments now felt like fragments from another life, as though they belonged to strangers who had borrowed their faces. He clung to them briefly, then released them with a deep sigh, because the woman he was waiting for tonight was no longer the same woman from those memories. Midnight crept closer, and finally the silence broke. The front door clicked open, slow and careless. She stepped in, her movements unhurried, her expression almost smug. Her perfume filled the room before her presence did, thick and intoxicating. A sharp reminder that she had been somewhere else, with someone else. Her makeup was slightly smudged, her lipstick faded, her hair no longer perfect. She carried her heels in one hand, the other lazily brushing her hair from her face. He remained seated in the armchair across the room, his gaze fixed on her as she entered. She avoided looking at him, as if his eyes were too heavy, too honest, too accusing. She moved with the ease of someone who no longer feared consequences, tossing her heels aside and slipping her purse onto the table with careless grace. He said nothing. He didn't ask where she had been, didn't demand explanations. He simply watched, his silence louder than any accusation. It was she who broke the quiet, and her words landed like a hammer on glass. Without turning to him, she said casually, almost with a hint of pride, "I got the attention I wanted." The sentence hung in the air, poisonous and unapologetic. She might as well have confessed everything in that one line. Her restlessness, her choices, her disregard for the life they had built together. The tone of her voice was not regretful, but defiant, daring him to react, daring him to make a scene. For him, the world seemed to stop. Those 6 words shattered what little illusion remained, tearing away the last veil that had protected his heart from the truth. He felt his chest tighten, not from anger, but from the finality of it all. There were no more excuses, no more denials, no more hope that things might return to how they once were. With that single sentence, their marriage broke, not with a dramatic fight, not with slammed doors or shouted accusations, but with a cold, careless confession. He sat in silence, absorbing the weight of her words, the way they pierced through everything he had held on to. The room itself seemed to grow stiller, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. He realized then that some things cannot be fixed, that some choices, once made, carve a permanent line between what was and what will never be again. For a long while after her words, the room remained suspended in silence. He could hear only the faint tick of the clock and the shallow rhythm of his own breathing. 1,000 emotions pulled at him: rage, heartbreak, disbelief, but he did not let them win. He had always been a man of patience, of quiet strength, and tonight, even in the ruins of his marriage, he would not abandon that part of himself. He looked at her, his eyes steady, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost too calm. "Then you don't need me anymore." The words surprised even him with their clarity. They weren't shouted, weren't heavy with accusation, but carried a weight that silence alone could not hold. She flinched slightly, as if she hadn't expected him to respond this way. Perhaps she had imagined a fight, raised voices, desperate pleading, accusations flung like daggers. Instead, she was met with a dignity that unsettled her more than anger ever could. Slowly, he rose from his chair. His steps carried him to the front door, where earlier that evening, in a haze of restless unease, he had packed a few of her belongings. It wasn't everything, just enough for her to understand what he had been preparing himself for, perhaps unconsciously, for weeks. The bags sat waiting, quiet proof of the decision his heart had already made. He turned back to her and gestured toward them. His voice remained firm, steady as stone. "Your things are ready. You can leave." Her face shifted from composure to shock. She had not expected this, not from him, the man who had always chosen patience over conflict, who had endured her coldness in silence, who had swallowed his questions night after night. He was now standing before her with an unshakable resolve. For the first time in a long while, she was the one unsettled. "You can't just throw me out," she snapped, her tone rising as if volume could reclaim the power slipping from her hands. Her eyes widened, searching his face for hesitation, for weakness, for some sign that he would back down. But there was none. He met her gaze with quiet certainty. "I'm not throwing you out," he said. "You already left me the moment you chose them over us." The truth of his words hit harder than any argument could. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but nothing came. For once, she had no clever retort, no excuse to lean on. The silence stretched, thick and unyielding. She looked at the bags again, then back at him, realizing the finality of what stood before her. He remained still, his expression unreadable, though inside his heart ached with a pain deeper than words. This was not the ending he had ever imagined, but it was the one her choices had written for them. And though it broke him, he would not beg for the pieces she had already cast aside. She stood frozen for a heartbeat longer, her expression twisted between anger and disbelief. Then, without another word, she grabbed the bags by the door and yanked them into her hands. Her movements were sharp, furious, as though the act of leaving could somehow punish him more than her presence already had. She stormed toward the door, the sound of her heels striking the floor like gavel blows. With one final glance, cold, resentful, and yet uncertain, she pulled the door open and stepped out. The slam that followed echoed through the house, rattling picture frames on the walls, then fading into a silence so deep it almost rang in his ears. For the first time in months, the house was still. No footsteps pacing. No phone buzzing with hidden conversations. No dismissive laughter tossed his way. Only the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the steady ticking of the clock on the wall remained. He stood in the center of the room, letting the emptiness wrap around him. It was heavy, yes, but strangely freeing too. The silence carried pain, but also a clarity he hadn't felt in a long while. The storm had passed, not because it had calmed, but because it had finally broken. The house, like his heart, was no longer suspended between doubt and denial. It was resting, waiting for what came next. He sank into the armchair, the same one where he had sat watching her walk in only hours before. His hands rested on his knees, and his eyes drifted to the clock. Each tick reminded him that time hadn't stopped with her departure. The world was still moving, even if his own world had just been torn apart. And as the minutes passed, he realized that this was not an ending carved in cruelty, but a decision that safeguarded his dignity. His thoughts unfolded slowly, like a monologue spoken only to himself. I gave her everything: patience, loyalty, love. I waited through her silences, forgave her coldness, stood by her even when I knew her heart was wandering. But if she needed the world's attention to feel alive, then my love was never enough. And that's not my failure, it's her choice. I can't hold myself responsible for the emptiness she carried inside. I was steady, I was true. She wanted more, or maybe just different. That isn't mine to fix. The words brought a strange comfort. He had spent so many nights wondering if he was the problem, if he had failed her in some hidden way. But now he saw the truth more clearly than ever. Love was not about begging for scraps of affection or competing with strangers for her attention. Love was respect, loyalty, and care, and those were things he had given freely. If she could not value them, then it was her loss, not his. The days that followed were not easy. The silence sometimes pressed too heavily, and the absence of her presence left corners of the house feeling colder, emptier. He caught himself listening for her footsteps or expecting her laugh in another room, only to be met with quiet. Grief came in waves, sudden and overwhelming. But beneath it all was a growing lightness, a space that slowly filled with something better than despair. Relief. He began to reclaim himself in small ways. He picked up old hobbies he had abandoned during the years of their marriage, reading books that gathered dust, cooking meals not for two, but for one, taking long walks in the evenings without waiting for her to return. Friends reached out, some offering sympathy, others offering distraction, and for the first time in a long while, he let them back into his life. The conversations, the laughter, the simple comfort of companionship reminded him that he was not alone, even if she had left. Gradually, the pain dulled, replaced by a quiet strength. He no longer replayed her words with the same sharp sting. Instead, he carried forward the lesson they had taught him, that self-respect was worth more than clinging to someone determined to leave. He did not regret loving her, but he would not regret letting her go either. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon and painted the sky in warm streaks of orange, he sat by the window with a cup of tea. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like his again, a place of peace, not tension, a place where he could breathe freely. He knew the road ahead would still hold moments of sadness, but it would also hold freedom, dignity, and perhaps someday new beginnings. For now, that was enough. He had chosen respect over humiliation, and in that choice, he found something greater than what he had lost. Thanks for watching. For more videos, please subscribe. Our channel, Awesome Visual Story,